Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Everyday English Podcast. I'm Emily, and today we're diving into a topic that's super important for all of our listeners: how to learn English efficiently. Joining me is my co-host, John. Hey, John.
Hey, Emily. Great to be here. This is such a crucial topic because, let's be honest, learning a language can feel like a huge mountain to climb. But with the right strategies, it can be a lot more manageable and even fun.
Absolutely, John. I think the first thing we need to talk about is mindset. A lot of people approach learning English with this idea that it's going to be really hard or that they're not good at languages. But the truth is, anyone can learn English if they approach it with the right attitude.
That's so true, Emily. Mindset is everything. You have to believe that you can do it. And once you have that confidence, the next step is to set clear, realistic goals. You can't just say, I want to be fluent. What does fluent even mean? Instead, break it down into smaller, achievable goals.
Exactly. For example, you could set a goal like, I want to learn 50 new words this week, or I want to be able to order food in English at a restaurant. These smaller goals are much more manageable and will keep you motivated as you progress.
And speaking of progress, consistency is key. You can't just study for 5 hours one day and then forget about it for the rest of the week. It's much better to study for 20-30 minutes every day. That way, you're constantly reinforcing what you've learned.
Totally agree, John. And when you're studying, it's important to use a variety of resources. Don't just rely on one textbook or one app. Mix it up with podcasts, YouTube videos, movies, and even social media. The more diverse your resources, the more well-rounded your learning will be.
That's a great point, Emily. And don't forget about immersion. If you can, try to surround yourself with English as much as possible. Change the language settings on your phone to English. Listen to English music. Watch English TV shows with subtitles. Anything that gets you thinking in English.
Yes, immersion is so powerful. And another thing I'd recommend is to practice speaking as much as possible. A lot of people focus on reading and writing but neglect speaking. But speaking is where you really solidify your learning.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to make mistakes. A lot of people get stuck because they're too worried about sounding perfect. But the truth is, making mistakes is how you learn. The more you practice, the more comfortable you'll become.
That's so true, John. And speaking of practice, finding a language partner can be a game changer. Whether it's a friend, a tutor, or someone you meet online, having someone to practice with can really accelerate your learning.
Definitely. And if you don't have access to a language partner, there are plenty of online communities where you can practice with other learners. The important thing is to keep practicing and not get discouraged.
Exactly. And don't forget about the power of repetition. When you learn something new, whether it's a word, a phrase, or a grammar rule, try to use it as much as possible. The more you use it, the more it will stick.
That's a great tip, Emily. And another thing I'd recommend is to focus on the most commonly used words and phrases first. You don't need to know every single word in the dictionary to have a conversation. Start with the basics and build from there.
Totally agree, John. And don't underestimate the importance of listening. Listening to native speakers is one of the best ways to improve your pronunciation, vocabulary, and overall understanding of the language.
That's so true. And speaking of listening, podcasts like this one are a great resource. You can listen to them anywhere, on your commute, while you're cooking, or even while you're working out. It's a great way to make learning English a part of your daily routine.
Absolutely. And another thing I'd recommend is to keep a journal in English. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. Just write a few sentences every day about what you did, how you're feeling, or anything else that comes to mind. It's a great way to practice writing and to track your progress.
That's a fantastic idea, Emily. And speaking of progress, don't forget to celebrate your wins. Learning a language is a long journey, and it's important to acknowledge how far you've come. Whether it's mastering a difficult grammar, rule, or having your first conversation in English, take the time to celebrate those milestones.
Yes, celebrating your progress is so important. It keeps you motivated and reminds you why you started in the first place. And finally, don't forget to have fun with it. Learning a new language should be an enjoyable experience. Find ways to make it interesting and engaging for you.
Couldn't agree more, Emily. So, to sum it up, set clear goals, stay consistent, Immerse yourself in the language, practice speaking, and most importantly, have fun with it.
Thanks, John. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. We hope you found these tips helpful. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more great content on learning English. Until next time, happy learning.
Bye, everyone. Keep practicing, and you'll be speaking English fluently in no time.
See you next time. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Emily, and I'm here with John to continue our discussion on how to learn English efficiently. In our last episode, we talked about the importance of mindset, setting goals, and staying consistent. Today, we're going to dive deeper into some specific strategies that can help you take your English to the next level. John, where should we start?
Hey, Emily. I think a great place to start is with vocabulary. A lot of learners feel overwhelmed by the sheer number of words they need to know, but there are ways to make it more manageable. One strategy I love is using flashcards, especially digital ones like Anki or Quizlet. They use spaced repetition, which helps you remember words more effectively.
That's a great tip, John. Flashcards are a classic tool for a reason. They work. And another thing I'd recommend is to learn words in context. Instead of just memorizing a list of words, try to learn them in sentences or phrases. That way, you're not just learning the meaning of the word, but also how to use it.
Exactly. Context is key. And speaking of context, reading is one of the best ways to expand your vocabulary. Whether it's books, articles, or even social media posts, reading exposes you to new words and how they're used in real-life situations.
Totally agree, John. And don't be afraid to challenge yourself with more difficult material. If you're reading something and you don't understand every word, that's okay. Use a dictionary to look up the words you don't know and try to guess the meaning from the context before you do.
That's a great point, Emily. And another thing I'd recommend is to keep a vocabulary journal. Write down new words you come across, along with their meanings and example sentences. Reviewing your journal regularly will help reinforce what you've learned.
Yes, a vocabulary journal is a fantastic tool. And don't forget about the power of repetition. When you learn a new word, try to use it as much as possible, in conversations, in writing, or even just in your head. The more you use it, the more it will stick.
Absolutely. And speaking of using words, don't forget about pronunciation. A lot of learners focus on vocabulary and grammar, but neglect pronunciation. But being able to pronounce words correctly is just as important as knowing their meanings.
That's so true, John. And one way to improve your pronunciation is to listen to native speakers and try to mimic them. You can use tools like YouTube or language learning apps that focus on pronunciation. And don't be afraid to record yourself and compare your pronunciation to that of a native speaker.
That's a great tip, Emily. And another thing I'd recommend is to practice speaking as much as possible. The more you speak, the more comfortable you'll become with the sounds of English. And don't worry if you make mistakes. That's how you learn.
Exactly. And if you don't have someone to practice with, you can always talk to yourself. It might sound silly, but it's a great way to practice forming sentences and using new vocabulary.
That's a great idea, Emily. And another thing I'd recommend is to focus on the most common phrases and expressions in English. These are the phrases that native speakers use all the time, and learning them will make your English sound more natural.
Totally agree, John. And don't forget about idioms and slang. They can be tricky, but they're a big part of everyday English. Just be careful with slang. It can be very informal and not appropriate for all situations.
That's a good point, Emily. And speaking of everyday English, watching TV shows and movies is a great way to pick up on how native speakers really talk. You'll hear a lot of idioms, slang, and casual expressions that you might not find in textbooks.
Yes, TV shows and movies are a fantastic resource. And if you're having trouble understanding, you can always use subtitles. Start with subtitles in your native language, and then switch to English subtitles as you get more comfortable.
That's a great tip, Emily. And another thing I'd recommend is to practice active listening. Instead of just passively watching or listening, try to really focus on what's being said. Pay attention to the pronunciation, the intonation, and the way sentences are structured.
Yes, active listening is so important. And don't forget about the power of repetition. If you find a TV show or movie you really like, watch it multiple times. Each time, you'll pick up on new words and phrases that you might have missed before.
Absolutely. And speaking of repetition, don't be afraid to revisit material you've already studied. Whether it's a textbook chapter, a podcast episode, or a vocabulary list. Going over it again will help reinforce what you've learned.
That's a great point, John. And finally, don't forget to have fun with it. Learning English doesn't have to be a chore. Find ways to make it enjoyable, whether it's through music, movies, or even games.
Couldn't agree more, Emily. So, to sum it up, focus on vocabulary, practice pronunciation, immerse yourself in the language, and most importantly, have fun with it.
Thanks, John. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. We hope you found these tips helpful. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more great content on learning English. Until next time, happy learning.
Bye, everyone. Keep practicing, and you'll be speaking English fluently in no time.
See you next time.